Well, we know, Elaine, that there were some active duty troops on standby in the Washington, D.C. area. And we have some brand new reporting from our David Martin, who says a defense official tells him that a decision to start pulling the first 200 troops out of bases around Washington and then sending them back to Forts Bragg and Drum was made, but then delayed because this official tells him there's still a lot of people in the streets and still a chance for things to reverse or turn violent. And this comes as CBS News did obtain a new memo from the Department of Homeland Security that suggests some of what they're calling violent opportunists have become emboldened in recent days by some of the violent attacks that have happened in cities nationwide. And we also have learned that it's a variety of bad actors or extremist groups who appear to be infiltrating some of these demonstrations. And in talking to the peaceful demonstrators, as we've seen, there are thousands of them marching in D.C. and around the United States. They do not want those acts of violence to interfere with or overshadow their much larger, more critical message of ending police brutality, ending racial injustice. Elaine.
Natalie, I want to ask you about Defense Secretary Mark Esper. He's breaking with the president over using the Insurrection Act, and he also addressed the issue of racial inequality today. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, this was very significant, and he did take this unusual step of weighing in on the killing of George Floyd and also racial injustice, as you mentioned. I want to read you part of his quote. He said, "Racism is real in America, and we must all do our very best to recognize it, confront it, and to eradicate it." And he talked about how he's tried to do that in the United States military. So an unusual or rare move to weigh in. We know that this is a discussion happening within institutions, within the halls of Congress, within the streets and homes across America and across the world. Then he went on to talk about defending the decision of using National Guard troops to basically uphold the constitutional right to free speech and peaceful assembly, essentially protecting those peaceful protesters out there. And we've seen them standing guard at monuments around D.C., such as that striking shot of the National Guard members on the Lincoln Memorial. But then he notably splits with the president and says he would not support using the Insurrection Act to use active duty military forces in an effort to quell some of the current unrest or violent protests in cities across the United States. And as we've reported, that's something that's been used usually at the request of state and local authorities, most recently in the 1990s against the rioting in Los Angeles in response to the Rodney King beating and acquittal of those officers in that case. But it is notable because just a couple days ago, the president was threatening use of military forces and telling governors he would send them in, Elaine.
Right, and you were there at Lafayette Park when, in fact, we saw that confrontation with those peaceful demonstrators. You're in the middle of it all. Natalie Brand for us. Natalie, thank you very much.
Yes.
President Trump's insistence on the use of force to deal with protesters he claims are being marshaled by left-wing extremists is in stark contrast to his three predecessors. Major Garrett and Eugene Scott join me now. Major is CBS News chief Washington correspondent, and Eugene is a political reporter for The Washington Post. Welcome to both of you. Major, let's start with the president's threat to send in the military to get states under control. Is there a sense among administration officials and Republicans that he went too far?
Not with the administration officials, and I would say most Republicans on Capitol Hill have been willing to say the president's on to something. He hasn't done anything yet, but raising this issue and getting the attention of governors and mayors with this threat to bring in the U.S. military is probably headed in the right direction. Now, critics would say that is just yet another supine response from Republicans who can find nothing about this president that they find overtly objectionable. They would also say in their defense the president is identifying areas of lawlessness and saying the military could possibly have a role. What the White House skips over is the historical application of the Insurrection Act, always, or at least in our modern history, in concert with governors who have heard from mayors who say our existing resources are exhausted and we need federal military assistance. As Natalie Brand pointed out, that happened after the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles in 1992 and Hurricane Hugo in 1989. So when the White House says, as the press secretary did today, the president has sole and sweeping authority to send the military in, that is in itself an extravagant interpretation of the Insurrection Act and presidential power. And it skips over what has historically been the contextual backdrop of that. Governors and mayors saying, we're exhausted, things are getting out of control, and we need, in specific instances, in specific geographies, and for this specific instance, help from the federal military. What's also interesting to note here in Washington, Elaine, is you can see on social media, Federal Bureau of Prisons special riot teams have been deployed on the city streets here in Washington. These are Bureau of Prisons employees trained to suppress riots inside a federal prison. They're not trained in any way or shape or form to deal with civilians or any kind of crowd dispersal, yet they're here. It is part of a bristling, federalized, quasi-military response to what has in almost all totality been peaceful demonstrations with certain examples of wildcat violence here in the nation's capital.
Eugene, let me turn to you. You recently wrote about how President Trump is trying to defend his legacy regarding Black Americans. What narrative is he attempting to push forward?
Well, one thing the president is aware of is that large percentages of the American public, more than half, according to Yahoo News and a YouGov poll, believe that Donald Trump is racist. This is a depiction of his character that he has not been able to shake since the earliest days of his 2016 campaign, and that's put him on the defense. Many people think that the president doesn't care about this perception, but he actually does. And so he took to Twitter to tweet out some of the things he believes prove that he's not a racist, and including his support for criminal justice reform and funding for historically Black colleges and universities. But what he has done in the White House often is quite different from the rhetoric that comes out of his mouth, or the lack of words affirming Black lives that come out of his mouth. And these are the things many Americans, and including people who are not Black, are making or paying attention to make their determination.
Well, Major, the president is facing criticism over two recent visits to houses of worship, St. John's Episcopal Church and the St. John Paul II Shrine. Do these visits help or hurt the president's relationship with his supporters?
Well, with his relationship with his supporters, particularly evangelicals and those Catholics who are in the strong conservative side of the American ideological spectrum, they probably help. And you could say the trip to the Catholic shrine on International Religious Freedom Day, you could sort of contextualize that and say, all right, that's maybe something that any president might do, but in our current context, it is clearly about increasing the visibility of Christianity within the White House as a political message and as a political multiplier, if you will. The president's support among those who believe that there is a cultural war in this country, or certainly a cultural schism that's gone on for a very long time. Rampant secularism would be one of the ways they might describe it. Find something valorous in the president walking across to St. John's Church and holding up a Bible. And just that powerful symbolic picture to them represents someone, to their mind, who is standing up for Christian principles in this country and is not afraid of being sneered at or being criticized by secularists or the left. And it's that exact divide the president loves to, and in this case, in our current context, wants to animate and draw attention to. So these are the very basic underlying political motives behind maneuvers such as that.
Eugene, I also want to ask about a piece you wrote Tuesday titled, "Why Trump's Ally of All Peaceful Protesters line rings so hollow." Take us through that.
In President Trump's first response beyond Twitter to the death of George Floyd in a formal speech, he sought to defend accusations that he was criticizing peaceful protesters. And he called himself an ally of all peaceful protesters. But anyone who remembers Donald Trump of the 2016 campaign, or even before, knows that the president was a vocal critic, should I say, of Black Lives Matter activists, even going so far as to suggest that if one of his rallies was interrupted by them, that he would perhaps get into a fight with them himself. We also know that he called for the firing and even suggested that NFL players who protest peacefully racism and police violence during the national anthem should be kicked out of the country, and used profane language to describe them as well. Some of his words for Women's March individuals and other Americans protesting his policies and his worldview and his administration show that he is not an ally of peaceful protesters. And in fact, has sometimes been an ally of violent protesters, such as protesters in Charlottesville, who he called very fine people, and some protesters during the Open Up movement, who we know got in the faces of police officers and yelled during the coronavirus pandemic, and even got in a bit of a tussle with some.
Well, Major, every former living president has now issued a statement on the death of George Floyd and acknowledged inherent problems in the justice system. How significant is that?
I think it's very significant. It's because we have reached this moment of not just recognizing an injustice in a particular case, but piecing it together as advocates for criminal justice reform and those who have talked about institutional racism have asked our country to do for decades. Much of the country is now hearing that message in an entirely different way and saying, you know, it's not just about this incident or that incident, this name, that location, this particular officer, this particular municipality. Perhaps it's part of a larger structure. And that is a very new conversation in our country, embryonic to be sure. But when you have every former living president in their own words and in their own ways saying, yes, this is an institutional problem. This is a legacy that our entire country has, and our indifference to it is part of their presidencies, but they don't want it to be a part any longer of their post-presidencies. It is, in its own way, a message of accountability and a message about what they failed to accomplish while they were president, or maybe, in their own words and for lack of actions, failed to recognize in the totality we're beginning to recognize and talk about as a country.
Well, Eugene, President Obama has not offered much criticism of the Trump administration until just recently. What has changed here?
I think a sense of urgency. I think the former president realizes that there is a very good chance that President Trump will win re-election. And in addition to completely dismantling the Obama legacy, or at least the workings of the administration, the former president risks just seeing the country go in a direction that is quite different from what he believes actually makes America great. And so he really wants to mobilize voters, and not just the left, but voters in the center, or even voters on the right who perhaps are very disappointed with the leadership coming out of the White House to back this current president. We are seeing approaches to issues that concern Americans, be it an economic downturn, a pandemic, or police violence, get a response from the White House that's quite different from anything that we've seen in the past. And President Obama, former President Obama, certainly wants people to know that this can be stopped and it doesn't have to continue.
All right, Major Garrett and Eugene Scott, thanks to you both.
Of course.
Coming up after the break, we will break down the ways states are preparing for Election Day and what they can do to ensure it's safe for voters in November. Stay with us. You're streaming Red and Blue.
In 60 years, we went from about 100,000 factory workers to probably about 7,000.
Off in the distance, you can see some factories that are still humming, but most of them are just kind of abandoned. The restaurant industry right now is one of the largest and fastest growing industries in America. And yet it continues to be the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States.
Barely anybody's making enough to live.
You're donating plasma to get by.
It's literally a slave wage.
I don't remember growing up like this. My mom didn't have to go to food banks.
It's pretty sad.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun. But wait,
There's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
I'm open to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
How do we put this in perspective about how worried we should be?
We're going to share the newest numbers and critical information on the outbreak.
Vladimir Duthier is tracking the plight of the restaurant business. Vlad?
You've been talking to doctors. What are they saying to you about their experiences?
We want to take you now to an event hosted by former President Barack Obama. Let's go ahead and listen in.
Michelle and I and the nation grieve with you, hold you in our prayers. We're committed to the fight of creating a more just nation in memory of your sons and daughters. And we can't forget that even as we're confronting the particular acts of violence that led to those losses, our nation and the world is still in the midst of a global pandemic that's exposed the vulnerabilities of our healthcare system, but also the disparate treatment and, as a consequence, the disparate impact that exists in our healthcare system, the unequal investment, the biases that have led to a disproportionate number of infections and loss of life in communities of color. So in a lot of ways, what has happened over the last several weeks is challenges and structural problems here in the United States have been thrown into high relief. They're the outcomes not just of the immediate moments in time, but they're the result of a long history of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and institutionalized racism that too often have been the plague, this original sin of our society. And in some ways, as tragic as these past few weeks have been, as difficult and scary and uncertain as they've been, they've also been an incredible opportunity for people to be awakened to some of these underlying trends. And they offer an opportunity for us to all work together to tackle them, to take them on, to change America and make it live up to its highest ideals. And part of what's made me so hopeful is the fact that so many young people have been galvanized and activated and motivated and mobilized. Because historically, so much of the progress that we've made in our society has been because of young people. Dr. King was a young man when he got involved. Cesar Chavez was a young man. Malcolm X was a young man. The leaders of the feminist movement were young people. Leaders of union movements were young people. The leaders of the environmental movement in this country and the movement to make sure that the LGBT community finally had a voice and was represented were young people. And so when sometimes I feel despair, I just see what's happening with young people all across the country and the talent and the voice and the sophistication that they're displaying. And it makes me feel optimistic. It makes me feel as if, this country is going to get better. Now, I want to speak directly to the young men and women of color in this country who, as Playon just so eloquently described, have witnessed too much violence and too much death. And too often, some of that violence has come from folks who were supposed to be serving and protecting you. I want you to know that you matter. I want you to know that your lives matter, that your dreams matter. And when I go home and I look at the faces of my daughters, Sasha and Malia, and I look at my nephews and nieces, I see limitless potential that deserves to flourish and thrive. And you should be able to learn and make mistakes and live a life of joy without having to worry about what's going to happen when you walk to the store or go for a jog or are driving down the street or looking at some birds in a park. And so I hope that you also feel hopeful, even as you may feel angry, because you have the power to make things better, and you have helped to make the entire country feel as if this is something that's got to change. You've communicated a sense of urgency that is as powerful and as transformative as anything that I've seen in recent years. I want to acknowledge the folks in law enforcement that share the goals of reimagining policing, because there are folks out there who took the oath to serve your communities and your countries, have a tough job, and I know you're just as outraged about the tragedies in recent weeks as are many of the protesters. And so we're grateful for the vast majority of you who protect and serve. I've been heartened to see those in law enforcement who've recognized, let me march along with these protesters. Let me stand side by side and recognize that I want to be part of the solution. And who've shown restraint and volunteered and engaged and listened, because you're a vital part of the conversation. And change is going to require everybody's participation. Now, when I was in office, as was mentioned, I created a task force on 21st century policing in the wake of the tragic killing of Michael Brown. That task force, which included law enforcement and community leaders and activists, was charged to develop a very specific set of recommendations to strengthen public trust and foster better working relationships between law enforcement and communities that they're supposed to protect, even as they're continuing to promote effective crime reduction. And that report showcased a range of solutions and strategies that were proven and that were based on data and research to improve community policing and collect better data and reporting and identify and do something about implicit bias in how police were trained and reforms to use the force that police deploy in ways that increase safety rather than precipitate tragedy. And that report demonstrated something that's critical for us today. Most of the reforms that are needed to prevent the type of violence and injustices that we've seen take place at the local level. Now, reform has to take place in more than 19,000 American municipalities, more than 18,000 local enforcement jurisdictions. And so as activists and everyday citizens raise their voices, we need to be clear about where change is going to happen and how we can bring about that change. It is mayors and county executives that appoint most police chiefs and negotiate collective bargaining agreements with police unions. And that determines police practices in local communities. It's district attorneys and state's attorneys that decide typically whether or not to investigate and ultimately charge those involved in police misconduct. And those are all elected positions. And in some places, they're police community review boards with the power to monitor police conduct. Those oftentimes may be elected as well. The bottom line is, I've been hearing a little bit of chatter in the internet about voting versus protest, politics and participation versus civil disobedience and direct action. This is not a either or. This is a both and. To bring about real change, we both have to highlight a problem and make people in power uncomfortable, but we also have to translate that into practical solutions and laws that can be implemented and we can monitor and make sure we're following up on. So, very quickly, let me just close with a couple of specific things. What can we do? Number one, we know there are specific evidence-based reforms that, if we put in place today, would build trust, save lives, would not show an increase in crime. Those are included in the 21st Century Policing Task Force report. You can find it on obama.org. Number two, a lot of mayors and local elected officials read and supported the task force report, but then there wasn't enough follow-through. So today I am urging every mayor in this country to review your use of force policies with members of your community and commit to report on planned reforms. What are the specific steps you can take? And I should add, by the way, that the original task force report was done several years ago. Since that time, we've actually collected data, in part because we implemented some of these reform ideas. So we now have more information and more data as to what works. And there are organizations like Campaign Zero and Color of Change and others that are out there highlighting what the data shows, what works, what doesn't in terms of reducing incidents of police misconduct and violence. Let's go ahead and start implementing those. So we need mayors, county executives, others who are in positions of power to say this is a priority. This is a specific response. Number three, every city in this country should be a My Brother's Keeper community, because we have 250 cities, counties, tribal nations who are working to reduce the barriers and expand opportunity for boys and young men of color through programs and policy reforms and public-private partnerships. So go to our website, get working with that, because it can make a difference. And let me just close by saying this. I've heard some people say that you have a pandemic, then you have these protests. This reminds people of the 60s and the chaos and the discord and distrust throughout the country. I have to tell you, although I was very young when you had riots and protests and assassinations and discord back in the 60s, I know enough about that history to say there is something different here. You look at those protests, and that was a far more representative cross-section of America out on the streets, peacefully protesting, and who felt moved to do something because of the injustices that they had seen. That didn't exist back in the 1960s, that kind of broad coalition. The fact that recent surveys have showed that despite some protests having then been marred by the actions of some, a tiny minority that engaged in violence, that despite, as usual, that got a lot of attention, a lot of focus, despite all that, a majority of Americans still think those protests were justified. That wouldn't have existed 30, 40, 50 years ago. There is a change in mindset that's taking place, a greater recognition that we can do better. And that is not as a consequence of speeches by politicians. That's not the result of, spotlights in news articles. That's a direct result of the activities and organizing and mobilization and engagement of so many young people across the country who put themselves out on the line to make a difference. And so I just have to say thank you to them and for helping to bring about this moment and just make sure that we now follow through. Because at some point, attention moves away. At some point, protests start to dwindle in size. And it's very important for us to take the momentum that has been created as a society, as a country, and say, let's use this to finally have an impact. All right? Thank you, everybody. Proud of you guys. And I know that we're going to be hearing from a bunch of people who have been on the front lines on this and know a lot more than I do about it. Proud of you.
Thank you, Mr. President. For everyone that's watching, the president decided he wanted to stay and be a part of the conversation that's going to be led by Brittany Packnett Cunningham with the Attorney General and other leaders. Before we go into that section, I want to reiterate the pledge that the president mentioned for mayors. So if you are a mayor, you can go to obama.org and you can take this pledge. And I also want to announce that several mayors have said, sign me up first, and they have already taken the pledge. Mayor de Blasio of New York, Mayor Lightfoot of Chicago, Mayor Frey of Minneapolis, Mayor Bowser of DC, Mayor Breed of San Francisco, and Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms of Atlanta, all my Brothers Keeper communities as well. So if you go to that page, you can take the pledge, and we will be posting all the cities and all the mayors that take the pledge. And then in 90 days, we are going to publicly report out who has taken the pledge and the work that's happening to create real lasting change in communities. So it is now my pleasure to introduce a friend, an activist, an educator, a writer, an NBC and MSNBC News contributor, a lifelong activist and member of the Ferguson Uprising, co-founder of Campaign Zero, a policy platform to end police violence, and co-host of Pod Save the People. Previously, she was an appointed member of the Ferguson Commission and President Obama's Task Force on 21st Century.
In 60 years, we went from about 100,000 factory workers to probably about 7,000.
Off in the distance, you can see some factories that are still humming, but most of them are just kind of abandoned.
The restaurant industry right now is one of the largest and fastest growing industries in America. And yet it continues to be the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States.
Barely anybody's making enough to live.
You're donating plasma to get by.
It's literally a slave wage.
I don't remember growing up like this. My mom didn't have to go to food banks.
It's pretty sad.
How do we put this in perspective about how worried we should be?
We're going to share the newest numbers and critical information on the outbreak.
Vladimir Duthier is tracking the plight of the restaurant business. Vlad?
You've been talking to doctors. What are they saying to you about their experiences?
Doctors and scientists in a race against time to cure coronavirus. Every evening we'll show how close they are, racing to a cure on the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell.
These are hard, tiring, taxing jobs, even before coronavirus came.
This is my Clorox wipes, my Lysol. I have no idea what I'm walking into. I don't know if the customers are carriers.